Nearly 2 years ago, Erin Patterson served her relatives a beef Wellington, laced with death cap mushrooms for lunch. Now she's on trial for murder. We've come to the regional town of Morwell in Victoria and built a makeshift studio near the courthouse to make sure you get all the details as soon as possible. We don't want you to miss a second of what's sure to be one of the most famous cases in Australian history. Hear a new episode every day on our podcast, Mushroom Case Daily. Follow us on the ABC Listen app.
ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
One night off the coast of Scotland, Barry McGovern was trying to help save a group of 32 stranded pilot whales. Barry and his colleagues had managed to get 10 whales back to sea, but 22 were dead on the shore. And the scientists had only a limited time to try and understand what had happened to these creatures. It was 11 o'clock at night and pitch black. They asked a local farmer to pull one of the whales up into the field on the cliff above, and then turned on all the car lights so they could do a post-mortem. Barry spends his time getting as close as he can to whales and dolphins. He grew up in a tiny village on the west coast of Ireland, and there were whales, dolphins and porpoises in the seas near his home, including a famous solitary dolphin at Dingle, whom the locals called Fungi. But just like a migrating humpback, Barry has made a journey from the cold waters of the northern Atlantic, where he was raised, to the temperate Pacific to study whales. He's now based in sunny Hervey Bay, where he's a researcher with Pacific Whale Foundation Australia. Hi, Barry.
Hey, how are you?
Tell me about that night off the coast of Scotland. What was it like when you arrived at the beach?
Yeah, it was a bit hectic. There was lots of people had gathered around. I was working for the Scottish Stranding Scheme. Now, we tend not to be overly involved with when the animals are still alive. We help out, give manpower or people power, I should say. Our job usually starts when the animals have died. But yeah, we arrived there and there was 32 animals spread along this beach and sort of no one really knowing what to do. So.
And do these whales, these kind of whales, pilot whales, do they usually swim in groups?
Yeah, they're highly social, but they're deep water animals. So when we have them in shallow areas, something's up.
And so when you arrived and thinking out what you're supposed to do, where did you start?
Oh, well, it's the British Divers Marine Life Rescue are sort of take charge there. So they deal with live stranded animals. And so we cordoned off an area and then we start to assess. You sort of triage the animals. Now, several would have already died at this stage, so they're obviously not candidates to be refloated. But what we want to do is identify any healthy ones and then try and get them back in the water.
And how do you do that? I mean, how big is a pilot whale?
It's pretty big. I mean, they're from the family Delphinidae, so the dolphins, but they're much larger than your typical bottlenose dolphin. You just look at them. I mean, if they're mammals, so they're breathing through their blowhole, and you look at the animals. If they have any injuries on them, something that looks pretty bad, they probably wouldn't be a candidate for refloating. But if they're looking healthy and breathing normally or somewhat normally, then they would probably be a candidate to at least attempt a refloat.
And how do you get that animal back into the sea?
Yeah, it's difficult. You need lots of people. So with a smaller animal, like a small dolphin, you could get a blanket or something like that if you had it and roll it under or slide it under the animal and then get, maybe 4 or 6 people either side to bring it out. But with a pilot whale, you need specialised equipment. And the British Divers Marine Life Rescue have these inflatable pontoons. So you put a pontoon either side of this big animal, slide a mat underneath it, clip the pontoons and then inflate them. And then as the water comes in, it rises the animal and then you can usher it out.
And they're used just to refloat stranded animals. Is
exactly,
what that technology is for. And once they're in the water, I mean, is the idea that they just swim off?
Some can do, yeah, but more often than not, you might have to stand with them for a time because depending on how long they've been on the shore, they sort of get land sick the way we can get seasick. And so they lose their balance, their sense of equilibrium. And you sort of have to hold the animal and shake it side to side to try and recalibrate that. And then suddenly they might kick in and just shoot off. But unfortunately, with many of them, because they're so disoriented, some of them will turn around and come back in. And so you try and have to usher them out again. And then at a certain point, you've got to make the decision, if they keep coming in, maybe this animal has something internal that we can't see, and maybe it's not a candidate for refloating.
For those animals that you could help, you did. But for the ones that had already died there, Barry, why was it important to do a post-mortem?
I mean, you want to know why they're dying, so the stranding scheme is employed to look at diseases and pathologies of dead animals on shore. Now, the vast majority of stranded whales and dolphins, cetaceans and porpoises, die of natural causes. It's often a single animal that has maybe died of some disease or illness. But these mass strandings, we call them, more than 2 animals, there you want to know in case any human impacts had caused the stranding. And so it's really important to do postmortems in that instance. And
why do you need to do it quickly?
Yeah, with certain parts within the animal, they decompose quite quickly. And in order to see if there was any acoustic trauma, so with these pelagic deep water species, the worry is that human activities such as naval exercises or seismic surveys can cause acoustic trauma, and this can be the reason why they come into the shallows. Now, they ultimately probably get caught out by the tide and drown, but the reason they come in there in the first place may be to do with acoustic trauma. And one of the ways we can look at this is looking at the cilia within the ear bones. So they have ears very similar to us, except they don't have the external apparatus for hydrodynamics. But within their ear, they have an ear very similar to humans. And within that, there's certain cilia, so little hair-like structures that are attuned to different frequencies. And so if we can get that out in time before decomposition occurs, we can have a look to see if there's any trauma in there.
Is it human activity that causes this acoustic trauma in whales and dolphins?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest impact is what we call masking. And it's just because we produce so much sound in the ocean that wasn't there, before the Industrial Revolution. And it covers their signals. So if they need to communicate or stuff and there's noise, they can't. It's like if you're in a noisy bar and the background noise is so loud, you have to almost shout, and that takes a massive toll on you, and sometimes the information won't get across, and so that's a big issue for whales and dolphins.
So are there great stretches of the ocean that are just noisy places?
Oh yeah, there's no ocean that isn't noisy now. So you can hear, like underwater, the sound travels 4 times faster than land, so you can hear sounds much further than you would on land, and so there's container ships that are continuously going, and there's small recreational vessels that are everywhere. And the container vessels produce a lower frequency sound, and that sort of masks the whales, the large whales, because they produce lower frequency sounds. But then the recreational vessels or things like that can mask the dolphin sounds at a higher frequency. And then there's also drilling and all sorts of noise.
And so for animals that partly use sound for navigation, echolocation, that's going to be hugely detrimental.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's not partly. They rely completely on sound. They can see underwater, but I mean, most often it's very difficult to see because the water is murky or it's at night, and so they completely rely on sound. It's their primary source of doing everything. So they get all their food, they communicate, and they navigate through sound.
So this mass stranding of pilot whales off the coast of Scotland, which you attended, Barry, it was dark, it was night. What did you decide to do?
We took a random individual. There was no rhyme or reason which one we picked, but we asked the farmer to pull it up, and we said, right, we've got time to pull the ear bones out of one animal. Let's do this random one. And so we pulled it. It happened to be a female. I can't remember quite right now. But
you were looking at the ear after all, yeah.
Yeah. And we pulled out the ear bones under with the lights of the car, and you fix them in formalin for later analysis. And so by the time the next day, all the ear bones we took out of the following 21 animals over the next day and a half, unfortunately they had slightly decomposed, and so we couldn't identify anything. But we did in that first animal that we pulled out, we did identify damage in cilia that would be related to the same frequency that may be caused by something like a seismic survey. Now, there was no direct link. There was no surveys in the area, and so there was no smoking gun, if you like. But it did show that, the method is a good one and it can identify it. And perhaps at some point, maybe this animal had some acoustic trauma.
That night in the field, I imagine it was cold.
Yeah. And
West coast of Scotland.
It was in the summer, I think. And so, we're well used to it. We rug up and everything. And the funny thing is, at that point, everyone, the locals, everyone wants to help when the animals are alive and they want to refloat it. And that's brilliant because it's a really difficult job that those guys do. And we help out too. And that's a really rewarding part. But when the animals need to be cut up, you don't tend not to find as many people willing to help. Now, in fairness, the farmer was brilliant, and we had our colleagues from London and Wales come up and join us because it was a huge operation, and there was lots of people from the local university, St Andrews University, the Sea Mammal Research Unit. They came to help, so there was plenty to help. But it was quite funny that once the live animals are done with, everyone just sort of disappears. You
don't want to take the selfies in the same way with that with the not. Autopsy moment. Does it smell when you're there with a whale carcass?
They're very fresh, so they don't smell like a decomposing carcass, but they do smell like, I don't know if you've ever cut up steaks and stuff. There is a certain smell, it's like iron, or I don't know what it is. But after a while, they do start to smell. And big animals, especially the larger whales, they get... we call it fizzy very quickly.
Fizzy. Is that a technical term?
Yeah, that's the technical term. And, they can turn pretty quick because they're big, massive animals and they just get very hot.
And that night for you, Barry, do you remember whether you were completely entranced by the scientific wonder of what you were a part of, or is there also, a side of you that's kind of got grief for the loss of this animal? How is it for you to be there in that moment?
Oh, yeah. I've worked with quite a few strandings in Scotland and in Ireland, and it can be really heartbreaking. But you have a job to do, so you've got to compartmentalise that, and you've got to say to yourself that, yeah, this is, it's very traumatic for the animal and seeing this, but, I've got a job to do, and we want to know why this animal was stranded. So, you've got to think clearly. It can be hard to do, I have to say.
You talk about the bigness of these animals. Is it the bigness of whales? Is that part of what you love about them?
Yeah, I think it's the idea that an animal, the size of a bus can exist and we know so little about it. That's one of the aspects. But then when it comes to the dolphins, we see them quite regularly. I think it's more the social side that intrigues me,
Barry, you grew up in Ireland, which isn't a place that I automatically associate with whales and dolphins, but you actually have a lot.
Yeah, we've got heaps of whales and dolphin species. I think it's over 22 now, and so we have the very largest blue whales to one of the smallest harbour porpoise.
So it was the West Coast that you grew up in. What did the main street of your village look like?
It's pretty small. It's a very popular place. It's called Lahinch in County Clare. It's really good surf, really good golf, and 12 really good pubs. So,
is that a pub per person, or what's the kind of ratio there?
Roughly, there was about 7. I think between 500 and 700 people there. But it swells in the summer because it's a real popular tourist destination. So there's lots of holiday homes, and every weekend it's lively. It's a really good spot to grow up in, but in the middle of winter, it can get a bit wild being on the West Coast,
Did you spend much time outside as a kid?
Oh, yeah. We had what we called it Sherwood Forest. It was a grove of about 4 or 5 trees near us, so we used to jump into them a lot. And we had what we called the cliff out the back of my house. It was an old broken down or closed down quarry, and that was, our Everest. So I spent a lot of time there, and then, of course, down the beach in the rock pools during the summer and swimming, things like that.
And what about birds? Because that would be an area for migrating birds as well as birds local to that area. What do you remember about that?
I'd say I'm a bit of a bird nerd. I'm not what you'd call a twitcher. I don't go to tick off all the sightings, but I'm very into birds. My folks, my mum and my dad were big into wildlife, and so that sort of... I grew up with that, I would go bird watching, and I'm surrounded where my folks live. I'm surrounded by farmland, and back in the 80s, there would have been loads of migrating birds.
So you've got dolphins, porpoises, whales off the coast. Were you aware of them as you were growing up? They're animals that you would see.
Yeah, I mean, you wouldn't typically see many of the whales unless you were on the water on a boat, but we would regularly see dolphins and the harbour porpoise as well.
And so this famous dolphin at Dingle, tell me about it.
Yeah, with Dingles down in Kerry, it's a good bit further south than where I am. It's a dolphin that sort of showed up around 40 years ago and used to follow some of the fishing boats. And people realised very quickly that it wasn't really interacting with other dolphins and tended to favour the company of humans. And so a whole tourism industry was built around it. And for 40 odd years, I can't actually remember how many, people would come in their, thousands, hundreds of thousands to see fungi and Dingle. I mean, Dingle's a beautiful spot anyway, but it really boomed because of him.
And, you shouldn't be shy to say that your own part of the world had its own dolphin too.
Yeah, it still does. I can't remember what year, but a few years ago, a single bottlenose dolphin female turned up and she just started hanging around on the coast of Clare. And I remember one day we were cliff jumping in Doolin, which is a thing that lots of locals do, and she must have heard the splashes, and all of a sudden we jump off the cliff and there's a dolphin right beside us. They call her Dusty because the story goes she turned up the day that Dusty Springfield's ashes were spread from Cliffs of Moher. Now, I don't know how true that is, but Dusty has stuck.
That is definitely true. That is definitely scientifically true. The spirit of Dusty Springfield is re-inhabiting this dolphin, harbour dolphin.
It,
At the start of your career working with whales and dolphins, you volunteered in America outside of Boston. What were you doing over there?
Yeah, I was up in Gloucester. It's about an hour north of Boston, and it's like one of the last kind of few towns where tourism isn't the primary industry. It's a real rough, I won't say rough town because it's just rough around the edges, let's say. It's a fishing town. And there was a research group there looking at humpback whales. And so I did a sort of an internship. I headed over to Boston, did a bit of work in Boston, and then headed up there for a few months.
And what are the humpback whales doing there?
So they're off of Gloucester in a place called Stellwagen Bank. There's really, I think it's an upwelling. So it's really rich feeding area, and the humpbacks there are there to feed.
And now this is a part of the world that gets really cold in wintertime. Were you going out to see whales in that season?
Not really, but on the turn. So sort of January, they have a lot of snow in Boston. It was a lot more than I'd ever experienced, But just sort of in the turn, as spring was coming, we started to go out. And so there was still some snow. I remember one day before we headed out on the boat, we had to shovel out about a foot of snow from the back, because it was just so heavy we couldn't, it would waste a load of fuel. But yeah, it's pretty cold there. So you're done up in what you call a Mustang suit. It's a onesie, but it's a thick onesie.
And what kind of things did you see on that trip?
Yeah, they're all there to feed on what they call sandlance. In Ireland, we call them sand eels. They're a small schooling fish, and they appear at that time of year in massive numbers. And so you have every predator in the area looking for a feed. You've got lots of gannets, the birds, they'll be diving. You'll have dolphins, you'll have porpoises. And then you'll have minke whales, which are a smaller whale than the humpback whale, and really fast and sleek. And then you'd have the giant fin whales. They're the second largest whale. And then, of course, the humpback whales are sort of the stars of the show and what everyone wants to see.
And you'd see all of those at once?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. You could have I call it the David Attenborough moment where you kind of sit back and you just look. You've got gannets, hundreds of them diving in on this big bait ball of fish. From beneath, you've got the dolphins pushing them to the surface. And then you've got minke whales coming through. And then all of a sudden, a big fin whale will come through. It's crazy.
Must be exhilarating to be in that environment.
It's a spectacle. Like, it's what you see on the BBC document, those fancy documentaries, the David Attenborough documentaries, and you're standing there going, wow, this is pretty impressive.
You're there in your Mustang suit rather than on your sofa watching all of that.
Barely walking, yeah.
You went off to university in Scotland to study animal biology and were working as a bird handler at Edinburgh Zoo on the weekends. What types of birds did you have to wrangle there?
Yeah, we weren't doing much handling. We would feed them for sure. But we had lots of species. There was stellar sea eagles, great grey owls. There was even a pair of cassowaries, which was quite cool.
These poor cassowaries, they are a long way from home. What did you have to do with them?
Yeah, a little bit colder than they're used to. You'd have to feed them, but they're one of the species that you wouldn't be allowed in the enclosure with. So
because they're too dangerous.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean they've got that front claw, and they have been known to do damage. And so, if there's ever been a potential of injury, then you've got to separate them. So we'd separate them off, and then you go in and clean their enclosure and put out their food.
You also worked with flamingos from Chile, who were also probably maybe a little bit chilly in Edinburgh. What happened, or what was unusual about breeding season and those flamingos?
Yeah, I mean, I worked there part-time as a zookeeper, I guess, but I also did my undergrad thesis on them. And so I looked at the aggression and behaviour in the lead up to a breeding season. We didn't do it there, but throughout the zoos, I think there is an unequal ratio. There are more males than females, for whatever reason, I don't know. But certain zoos have found that male-male pairs, so sometimes the males, if there isn't an available female, they'll pair up with a male because the urge to breed is so strong in them. And in some zoos, they've found that male-male pairs tend to be better parents than male-female pairs. And it might be because they're maybe more aggressive so they can defend a nest or whatever reason, not really sure. But in certain places where we'll say a new male-female pair that haven't been raised an egg yet and so are sort of naive to it, the zookeepers will take the egg off them and give them a dummy egg and give the egg to a known male-male pair that have already raised a chick in the hopes that it would have a better chance of survival.
I saw it was in Chile, flocks of flamingos in the salt deserts. They're just amazing to see those pink birds against the white salt. But my memory of them, I guess like lots of birds, is they get pretty easily spooked. Was that the case of the flamingos under your care too?
Yeah, I mean, they're used to these big salt pans and they can see everything coming. So they can get very, they're a little bit nervous in a zoo setting where there might be trees and kids, around. And I remember we used to have to go in and clean their pen, their feeding area, and they would all huddle together in a group and just honk and walk away from you. But the key is you'd have to remember that they're not used to having lots of things in front of them. They're used to being in flat sand pans. And if you left something like the hose with a kink in it, which I did once, they could easily trip over it. And I remember when one went, the entire flock went, and I was like, oh no, here we go. I mean, they were fine and everything, but you have to be really careful with them. They're a little bit nervous.
Your passport must have a lot of very interesting stamps in it, Barry, because on another trip, a research trip, you went to Namibia, where you were there to look at dolphins. But you found yourself out in the bush taking photographs of giraffes. How did that happen, and how different was that to looking at sea animals?
Yeah, it was great. I was down in Namibia in a place called Walvis Bay, working with the Namibian Dolphin Project and Sea Search Africa, doing research on dolphins there. But a friend of mine who I had brought out on our boat, and shown her what we did, she said to me, you got to come with me. She was doing her PhD on giraffes up in the northwest coast area of Namibia. She said, you got to come with me when we're doing some remote field work. And I was like, you don't have to ask me twice. So anyway, we had I think it was like 7 days, and up there isn't many garages or shops, so you've got to bring all your water and all your fuel. Now you draw your map so you can take in as many garages or petrol stations as possible, but you've got to bring everything with you. In a satellite phone, there's no coverage. And so we're up there and we're, she's doing photo ID of giraffes, so that's how you can estimate the abundance of them. And she's also taking biopsy samples, so to look at things like genetics. And so she'd asked me to take photos because that's what I do with whales and dolphins. We do the exact same process, but just with different animals. And so we're driving close, and I spot the giraffe, and I start shooting off my camera, taking loads of photos. And she's like, "What are you doing?" And I was like, "Oh, the giraffe's there. It might go." And she's like, "No, this is not like whales and dolphins. They just stay there." And you could just see this giraffe just munching away on the top of a tree. And as we got closer, it did not care. And so you can easily get the perfect photo. Whereas with the dolphins and whales, you got to take your chance when you get it. Otherwise, you mightn't get another.
What about giving a giraffe a biopsy? How do you go about doing that?
Yeah, she shoots them with a rifle with a little dart, and it's got a little plug at the top that just takes a small skin sample. And again, we do something similar with whales and dolphins. We sometimes use crossbows, depending on what country you are and what the laws are. But again, with the whales and dolphins, you don't get many chances. So if a whale comes up, no matter how far, if it's within shooting distance, you take that shot. Whereas with the giraffe, I remember, she drove the car closer and got settled and took a big deep breath, and the giraffe doesn't even care, and so I was like, yeah, maybe I chose the wrong species to work on.
You needed to help her catch a giraffe on that trip. What did that involve?
Yeah, so one giraffe had a tracking collar on it around the horns of its head, and they needed to change the batteries on that. And so you have to physically catch the giraffe, and it basically involves you try and usher the giraffe into something like a dry riverbed. And then you have a vet on hand, and they'll dart it with a drug, which sort of dulls its senses. Now, it doesn't knock it out, but it dulls its senses, and it tends to then run in a kind of a straight line, and so it follows the riverbed. And so we did this. Anyway, we found the giraffe and shot the dart into it, and it started running. And then the next thing you do is you drive a ute, and you've got two people, probably your tallest people, with a rope in the back, and 6 or 7 other people. And you drive maybe 150 meters in front of the giraffe, and everyone jumps off. The 2 people with the rope then have to stretch the rope across the riverbed and hold the rope as high as you can, because giraffes are pretty tall, and then run as fast as you can in sand. And then the giraffe runs straight into this rope. Now, you can't stop because the giraffe is huge. If you stop, it'll fire you 40 meters in the air, So you just run as fast as you can. And it was me and this other German guy, just happened to be the tallest lads. So I was like, oh no, here we go. And anyway, you run and run and run, and it eventually wears the giraffe down. And also the drugs start to take a toll, and it does slow down, but it's fast. And then just as it sort of stops, the 2 people with the rope sort of cross behind the giraffe, and you effectively trip it up. And then everyone, 2 people on the head, the rest of the people jump on the body. The vet takes its samples, does its job, and changes the headgear, and then everyone jumps off and the giraffe runs off.
Barry, you were describing a little stint catching giraffes in Namibia, but you were really in the country to work with dolphins. Did you find any dolphins?
Oh, yeah. They've got 2 species that are resident there, bottlenose dolphins, which are what everyone are very, used to. And they've got a lovely species called the heavy-sides dolphin, a little black and white, very cool, and really what we call boat-friendly. So they always come to the boat to ride that wake at the front,
What about whales? Are they sometimes as interested in you on the boats as you are in them?
Yeah, that's more at the individual level. So, for example, in Hervey Bay in August, you have what we call subadult humpback whales. Now, they're not sexually mature, but they're not dependent on their mother, so they're not with their mom anymore. And so they seem to have more time in their hands. They can't go, they will go to the breeding grounds, but they can't breed. And so they're way more into the boats. And honestly, the August whale watching in Hervey Bay is some of the best, because these sub-adults, now they're much smaller, so they're not as big as the big adults, but they are into the boats.
You had a close encounter with a whale off the coast of South Africa. What happened there?
Yeah, I was working with Sea Search Africa, and we were out doing work on basically whatever species we could find. But there's a species down there, we get it here in Australia too, called a Brutus whale. And they're typically shy, and there's not a huge amount known about them. But I remember one day we had this female, and we saw her, so we stopped and we started doing our usual stuff. We take photo IDs and take behavior and all the data that we need. And she got closer and closer. And when that happens, you've got to put your engines out of gear. You don't want to hit the animal, or especially with the propellers. So you pop it out of gear, and this animal just circled us for well over an hour and a half, and at that point we've turned off the engines, and you've collected all the data you need to collect, so then you just enjoy, the encounter. It's not often that an animal, like I said, the size of a bus decides to, once it wants to hang around your boat and rub itself off it and things like that. And I forgot that they're really, really long. And so the head was this end, and I'm looking at the head taking photos, and the tail came, and it's the size of a small airplane on her side, and it just slapped me across the jaw. Yeah, that was the closest I've ever been to a healthy live whale. And I won't do that one again, because that woke me up for sure.
It didn't knock you in the water?
No, it wasn't that hard. It was more like a little graze, and I'm sure it would. The size of these animals, they could seriously damage you. But no, it was more embarrassment than pain, I think.
After you'd spent time studying animals in Ireland, Scotland, Namibia, what brought you to Australia?
It started to get a little bit difficult in Namibia and South Africa. The funding can be, I guess it's not as politically stable as many of the developed countries. And so it was just time to leave. And there was a PhD in a lab that I had several friends doing PhDs, and they were looking for someone to do a PhD, and it was good timing for me to come.
And what was your PhD focused on, Barry?
Yeah, I looked at information encoded in the acoustic repertoire of Indo-Pacific bottlenose dolphins.
So the way that dolphins, bottlenose dolphins, communicate.
Yeah.
What sort of sounds do dolphins make?
Oh, they've got sort of two different types of communication sounds. So they use whistles and they use clicks. Now, they also use clicks for echolocation, similar to how bats find their food and navigate. But they can package those clicks together and send a lot of information in one go. But one really cool thing about bottlenose dolphins and several other species, but we know more about the bottlenose dolphins, is they've got what we call a signature whistle. And it's very similar to a name, if you like. Each dolphin has this whistle that's unique to it, and it uses this when it announces itself or keeps in contact. And then my PhD looked at that to see, does it also encode different information? So it encodes the information regarding the individual, but it also encodes things like their emotions. So, if they're maybe feeling happy or aggressive or something, they can encode that within slight changes of this signature whistle. Now, while still maintaining the whistle to ensure that everyone knows who owns it, but they can encode information regarding their emotions in it as well.
That's extraordinary. Is that a whistle that they learn or that they're born making, or how does that happen?
So they develop it in the first year of their life. We think that it's sort of developed based on sounds that they might hear around, but they don't tend to develop one that's very similar to their mum's, and that sort of makes evolutionary sense. You don't want a very similar whistle to your mother's because, that could get confusing. But yeah, they'll listen to their mum's signature whistle when they're within their mum, so they'll know that straight away and they'll always recognize it. And then they'll develop their own in the first year. And
is it possible for you as a researcher to hear some dolphin communication and have a sense of what they're communicating? I mean,
if I suppose there are times. I mean, I was at a stranding in Ireland in Mayo, and there was a dead common dolphin, but it was a mum, and it had her calf swimming around it, and I was up to my knees, and the calf was tiny, and you could hear the calf whistling constantly, and you just could feel that it was a distressing signal. But knowing what's in it, it was really just that you could hear this animal calling over and over and again, and it would be similar to a human. If something happened to a young child's mum, it would call it over and over again. And so I think you can feel it in that instance. But it's in the instance, we probably don't know what they're saying, but we can record them and then start to look. So what I did for my PhD, for example, is we would record these sounds, but at the same time we had video cameras, so we could link the sound up to behaviors. And then we could look for subtle changes in these sounds with changes in behavior. And so when the animals are aggressive, they tended to switch from whistles. They would first start to produce more whistles, but when it got to a more aggressive interaction, they would switch from whistles over to these clicks. And we think it was because in the heat of the moment, when things are happening really fast, these clicks can get across information quicker than the whistles. And so if they're in the middle of a fight or an interaction like that, they want to get across as much information as they can quickly. And so they switch from whistles.
Go away.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
How do those whistles and clicks compare to the songs that whales are so famous for making?
Yeah, I guess, the song that only humpbacks are famous for making. I mean, other whales make noises, but only humpbacks sing these songs. They're very different. So the humpback whale songs is a really complex behavior, and it's not really what we associate with whales. So we tend to think that the dolphins, for example, are much more social than the whales. And so when you're more social, you need to develop sort of much more acoustic communication because it's quite complex. And so when humpback whale sings this really complex song, it's not what we expect. And so it's just another of the things that show how interesting they are. But those songs are sort of unique in the cetacean or in the whale dolphin porpoise world in that no other species has something as similar. And it's the complexity. They marry up all these sounds to create phrases and chorus, verses, and it's really impressive.
And what's the current understanding of why whales do that? As you say, they're much more solitary than, say, dolphins. Why are they singing these elaborate, complex songs?
Yeah, I mean, they're less social than dolphins, but they do have to be social to a certain degree, and that's especially during the mating time. Now, they are also social in the feeding areas, but in the mating grounds is when you have to be social, And so we're not entirely sure whether it's a display to the females or to the other males or a little bit of both. So what we do think is it's maybe something like what we call a lek. And so in terrestrial animals and birds, a lek is where males will form an area and they'll, do a display, whether it's an acoustic one or a visual one, to show everyone else how strong they are. And that's to show other males how strong they are so they don't want to fight, and to show females who are looking for, someone to breed with. And so it's probably something similar to that. So these whales make these sounds, and maybe within them, another male or a female can pick up on something to say, oh, that sounds like a healthy male that might be worth breeding.
Do female whales make songs as well, or is it just males?
No, only the males sing that we know of. They make lots of sounds, the females, and social sounds, and mums and calves will constantly be in acoustic communication, but we don't think they sing.
Hervey Bay, where you're based at the moment, Barry, is of course famous as part of the whale migration. What brings the whales past Hervey Bay? At what stages of their journey are you likely to see them?
Yeah, they actually mostly only come on their southern migration. So they tend to bypass Hervey Bay on the way north. So they're heading up to the Great Barrier Reef, which is where where the majority of them breed. And then after they've done whatever they need to do up there, on the way down, then they stop into Hervey Bay. And we sort of get what we call a trickle migration. So around sort of late July and August, we get the subadult animals that I was talking about. And then in September, we get the mums and calves coming through.
How long do the mothers and calf humpback whales stay together, typically?
So that's sort of the longest association that we know of in humpback whales, and they'll stay together for about a year. So, yeah, they'll, like I said, they'll breed in the Great Barrier Reef and then migrate down to Antarctica, and then after about a year, they'll separate.
And are those calves still feeding from the mums all that time that they're together?
While they're migrating south, yes. Down in Antarctica, they're probably still feeding a little bit, but they're also starting to learn to feed on fish.
What is whale milk like, Barry?
It's quite thick. People have likened it to cottage cheese. It's full of fat and all the good stuff that the whales need, that the baby needs to put on weight. And
do the babies feed, like, are the nipples on the outside of the whale, or how does this all happen in the ocean?
They're sort of internal, so because they have to be, everything has to be internal to be hydrodynamic. But the calf will come up to what we call the mammary slits, where the nipple is inside, and stimulate the mom to then protrude them, and then she'll squirt milk into the calf's mouth.
And what kind of energetic toll does that take on the mothers? Are they getting in protein at the same time as they're giving out this magic cottage cheese like breast milk?
Yeah, no, they're not at all. They're like the superheroes of the mother world. They spend. They build up their entire year's energy down in Antarctica, where they feed on krill or small schooling fish. And then when they migrate north, they don't feed again for months. And if they're pregnant, they'll give birth and then nurse this calf for months without feeding at all. And they first start to feed. There is a little bit of evidence that they feed maybe in places like Eden in New South Wales. But even then, it's sporadic. They're not feeding on a lot, and some of them won't feed again until they come back to Antarctica, which is half the year starving themselves while nursing this calf. And
why would that be? Why would they not feed at the same time?
I mean, that's just the system they have. We call that capital breeding, and it's probably because the energetic content of things like krill and, you know, small schooling oily fish is so high, and they feed on them in such masses that it probably doesn't make sense to feed on other fish up north, because it's quite energetically costly for large whales to even open and close their mouth.
Really?
Yeah, because they take in so much water. To close that jaw again takes a lot of energy. And so it's probably just not energetically efficient to feed outside of Antarctica.
Right. So they wait to get home and have like a massive bowl of protein pasta rather than just snacking as they go back and forth.
Yeah, the key is they build up these really thick blubber layers. So humans can't do that. We can't store that much energy. They have thick blubber layers. And when they're leaving Antarctica, they are fat. Or at least they should be if they're going to do what they need to do. And of course, that's the issues with, you know, things like climate change and that. If we're impacting how they can put on this weight, then maybe it'll impact how successful they will be at breeding.
That's an amazing fact to me, that it takes an enormous amount of energy for a humpback whale just to open their mouth. When it does come time for them to make that effort and to feed, do they do so in groups or solo?
They can do both. So depending on where they are, I know in Alaska there's groups of maybe up to 12 animals that can feed together, and they'll do these elaborate, what we call bubble curtains, to corral fish, and then they'll work together.
What's the bubble curtain? How does that work?
Oh, so they can, underwater, they can blow bubbles out their blowholes. And they're
I love that you tap your head as you're saying that. That's where your blowhole would be, yeah, right?
Yeah, but it's actually,
it would
be like your nose, but it'd be at the top of your head, you know? So they'll blow bubbles out underwater, and they're big bubbles, and they can basically create a barrier that fish won't pass. And they'll do it in circles around a shoal of fish to corral them closer and closer. And so then they'll come up in the middle of that bubble net where all the fish are, and in one mouthful scoop up way more fish than they'd be able to without the bubble net. It's basically creating a net.
Amazing. So back to your part of the world where the whales are coming down with their calves after having bred and had their babies further north in the Great Barrier Reef. As they make their way south, are they just travelling in as mother and baby, or what do you observe about the kind of social dynamics as they make their way down to those feeding grounds in Antarctica?
Yeah, I mean, most of the time they are that. So mums and calves will be going very quietly and they want to be under the radar. Now, we don't have many predators in Queensland, but later on they'll be in waters where they meet a lot of killer whales, and you want to be very quiet then. But what we have noticed, we've done some research, and we found that as the mums and calves are travelling further south, along Australia at least, we found that the mums and calves tend to form social groups with other mums and calves. And this is not seen elsewhere, particularly in the breeding grounds, because in the breeding grounds, the calves are quite young and, you know, susceptible to be injured by another animal. And so the mums just want to keep them very separate, particularly around other large whales. But later, as the calf kind of grows up, they tend to form these groups. And we think that the idea is that they're forming them to socialize their calves, very much like how humans do. You know, when we have a young baby, we tend not to socialize them because they're very small and they can easily be injured. But once they get to that kind of play school age, we need to socialize them because they have to develop these social skills that are so important to them.
So what does socialisation for a whale calf look like? What kind of activities are they doing? It's not jigsaw. It's not like turn taking in board games. What are they doing?
No, it's in Hervey Bay anyway. We see them doing a lot of social or surface activities. So surface activity includes things like tail slaps and pectoral fin slaps and things like that. And they'll kind of chase each other. And all the time, maybe the mums are just cruising along and maybe having a rest, but the calves are kind of playing, and you can see them doing a lot of surface activity.
Is there anything that looks like discipline from those mothers to the calves?
I mean, probably it's hard to identify it in humpback whales or big whales, but I've seen it in dolphins for sure. When I was doing my PhD, we were out at Tangalooma looking at the dolphins there. We were recording them there. and there was a specific calf called Calypso, and he was about 2 at this stage, and the mom was, still nursing with the mom, but I would imagine the mom getting a bit sick of him, all the time. And at night, they do a feeding program there, and at night, Calypso would sort of go off into the dark, and you could very clearly on our acoustic recordings hear its mother calling its signature whistle really loud a couple of times, and then all of a sudden the dolphin shoots in and he's like, "Oh, sorry, Mom," So we can only speculate. We're not sure that's what she was doing, but it very much looked like, "Hang on a second, you're too far away, there's sharks around, come in here now." But in the humpback whales, I don't know, it's maybe a little harder to identify.
I think that we imagine dolphins as being these very peaceful, playful kind of animals. Your research into bottlenose dolphins, it's not quite like that in the real world.
Yeah, I mean, bottlenose in particular, they're probably the most well-studied animal, or cetacean, sorry. And they have a very sort of male-dominated society, and can be quite aggressive and quite political. Not dissimilar to chimpanzees or even humans back in the day, But it can be quite aggressive. The males will form what we call alliances, and these can last their entire lifetime. Now, it's basically forming groups so they can be competitive when a female, an estrus female, is ready to breed with, and so they can compete with other groups of males to get that female, and it can be quite aggressive.
You're studying these creatures, Barry, that in contrast to giraffes are inconveniently under the surface of the ocean for a lot of the time and far away from humans. I mean, how much is still unknown about even just the biology, let alone the behaviour of whales and dolphins?
Oh yeah, there's heaps that we need to learn. I mean, we understand biology pretty well, actually. Stranded animals, however unfortunate it may be, gives us a massive opportunity to collect really quality data. But some species that don't strand often or don't strand fresh, maybe they die far out to sea. There's a group of toothed whales called beaked whales, and they're these deep divers, and we know so little about them because we don't see them much. And even some species have never even been seen alive. So, I mean, there are, new technology is helping us. I think we use drones to measure the body condition of whales and dolphins now, and that's really opening a whole new avenue, and we're starting to see behaviours that we just didn't know existed before. But even still, you're only glimpsing part of their lives. And if you're on a boat with a group of dolphins or a whale, a couple of kicks of their tail and they're gone and you won't see them again. So if they don't want to be seen, they can easily, evade you. So we try our best. I would say there's a lot to learn still.
What would you most love to know? What secret of either whales or dolphins would you be most fascinated to know the answer to?
I really like the social aspect of them. I like the idea that these dolphins are playing politics, and they're not just, most animals, there's the urge to pass on your genes, of course, but to get to that end goal, it's not as simple as you just mate with a female. You find you've got to create, in the case of bottlenose dolphin, you've got to create relationships with males and then other male groups in order to get to that end goal. And I think it's quite reflective of, our society. I mean, now we're very different humans. We're modernized and civilized. But, it's not that long ago when we would have been doing something similar, I guess, And I think the reflection of our own society in them is what really is interesting to me. And I just like to learn those kind of things.
And when you make that comparison with chimps, I guess it's easy to observe how chimps are trying to build alliances or fights or, those kind of social relationships are really observable. But what's alliance building look like among dolphins? What, they just swim closer next to one or what happens?
Yeah, exactly. You can see an alliance because they will synchronize their behaviors quite often. And so if there's, for example, an alliance of 3 individuals, they'll surface very close together in perfect synchrony, not always. And of course, when it comes to herding is what they call when they're trying to mate with a female, they'll, spread around her, but then they'll start to use acoustic cues and they'll start to click to each other. And so they're the sort of things that you'll start to see. But when they're young and they're sort of developing these alliances, they'll just be playing with each other. It's quite intriguing. They'll often have their penis out and males with their penises out. And that's quite a common thing to see. And that's just them sort of getting to know each other and working out if this is going to be my buddy for the rest of my life,
What do you think that little boy on the west coast of Ireland, looking at birds and peering into rock pools, what would he think of the life that you're living on the other side of the world?
Oh, yeah, I think, I guess a lot of people, when they're young, they say they want to be this or this when they grow up, but this is what I wanted to do. When I was young, I always wanted to work with animals. I didn't know what capacity, and I didn't know what a marine biologist was, but I think I'm probably living what I would have wanted to do, yeah.
And what I can see, Barry, is you get to wear thongs to work, which is living the dream.
Yeah, I know, and that's not an Irish boy's dream, I'll tell you that for sure. But that's not bad, eh?
Really lovely to meet you, Barry. Thank you so much for being my guest on Conversations.
Yeah, my pleasure, thank you.
This episode was produced on Yagra and Turrbal lands. Alice Moldovan was the producer of today's story. Our executive producer is Nicola Harrison. And if you haven't heard already, Conversations is going on tour. Richard and I will be heading to all the capital cities in August. The show about the show. We've never done anything like it before, and we're both very excited. I hope you can join us. All the details are at the Conversations website. I'm Sarah Kanoski. Thanks for listening.